Formative assessment, pre-service teachers learning and evolving knowledge. The impetus for this talk is my belief that formative assessment is at the core of effective teaching and learning. I'm going to use the following outline to guide the presentation. The current definition of formative assessment adopted in this talk states that formative assessment is a planned, ongoing process used by all students and teachers during learning and teaching to elicit and use evidence of student learning to improve student understanding of intended disciplinary learning outcomes and support students to become self-directed learners. The current definition we see here embodies several components. The effective use of formative assessment requires students and teachers to integrate and embed key practices in a collaborative and respectful classroom environment. These practices show up in various ways, depending on the teacher, students, and discipline. There is also evidence in the literature of attributes of effective formative assessment, which I conceptualize as subsystems of the formative assessment system, which itself is a subsystem within a balanced assessment system. Given the complex nature of formative assessment, it is important to identify a framework that will guide understanding of effective formative assessment. In her popular book, Meadows defines a system as an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. The primary purpose of formative assessment is to provide evidence that is used by teachers and students to inform instruction and learning during the teaching and learning process. We can therefore better understand formative assessment through a systems thinking lens. Systems thinking is a holistic approach to analysis that focuses on the way that a system's constituent parts interrelate and how systems work over time and within the context of larger systems. A conceptual model of formative assessment clearly depicts a systems approach in understanding formative assessment. The formative assessment model is defined by key processes facilitated by teacher and involving students, establishing where students are supposed to be in their learning, establishing where students are, and establishing how to get students to where they are supposed to be. The model also shows strategies that define effective formative assessment, clarifying understanding and sharing learning intentions, engineering effective classroom discussions, tasks, and activities that elicit evidence of learning, providing feedback that moves learners forward, activating students as learning resources for one another, and activating students as owners of their own learning. The conceptual model represents a complex system with multiple subsystems, making formative assessment a rather complex process to easily comprehend and implement. The current definition that I present here focuses or stresses disciplinary learning outcomes. So now let us switch to a specific discipline, which is science education. What is the purpose of science education? Science education is to ensure that by the end of 12th grade, all students have some appreciation of the beauty and wonder of science and are able to continue to learn about science outside of school and have the skills to enter careers of their choice. The question that is guiding this presentation here is, how does a small liberal arts college ensure secondary school science teacher candidates gain the foundational knowledge of formative assessment towards becoming accomplished teachers? The context here is a small liberal arts college located in the northeastern region of the United States, with a small secondary education program that averages 30 students a year, with only a small number of science candidates, not usually more than 5. In the small liberal arts college, students are required to take courses in the secondary education program listed here, in addition to courses in their content areas, as well as fulfill the college core requirements. There is an order of schedule of progression in taking the courses for most students in the program that begins with the educational psychology course in the freshman or sophomore year and ends with student teaching in the senior year. Teachers must have foundational knowledge, right, that will enable them to implement effective formative assessment. Their knowledge must be focused not only on the general knowledge on formative assessment, but they must have knowledge on science to understand the development of students' understanding of science to be effective in formative assessment. Many states have adopted the next generation science standards characterized by 3 dimensions. Teacher candidates must be knowledgeable in these standards that define what students should know, which will enable them to establish what students know and create strategies to close the gap between what students know and what they are supposed to know. Students are introduced to various elements relevant to formative assessment in the program, but they formally learn about formative assessment in the educational measurement course that I teach, and that focuses on classroom assessment. The example I will share on teacher candidates' practice of formative assessment are based on some key practices that define formative assessment. Evidence that I have collected shows that students at the end of the junior year, their shift from perceiving formative assessment as a thing like exit slip to formative assessment as a process that embodies multiple components. They share explicit goals and success criteria that guide students to be engaged in metacognitive learning. They are also able to refer to substantive knowledge that students must share through practices to demonstrate their knowledge. They are able to create logical lesson and unit plans that show a progression of learning and intentional breaks for formative assessment. The students' formative assessment practices are based on science content. In the case of biology teacher candidates, I've been able to identify some samples here that would show how they have attained some knowledge and skills in formative assessment. In this lesson on Punnett Square, we see that the teacher candidate demonstrates knowledge in the performance expectation defined by the 3 dimensions of the next generation science standards. The students are also able to share explicit learning goals that students are supposed to attain at the end of the lesson. They identify the standards and are able to create these goals that align with the standards. With respect to the instructional sequence that the students identify on the lesson plan, we see examples like this one. The students state do-nows that students have to be engaged in. And what they say about the do-nows for this example is a case of a photo that the students are shown, and these students are supposed to share their thoughts and respond to questions that would guide their thinking. The rationale for this activity is that students are able to assess their prior knowledge, and this will permit the teacher to adjust the lesson based upon their presented knowledge. Another activity in the instructional sequence is seen in how the teachers are planning to engage the students in responding on what they have actually learned. The rationale here is a diagnostic assessment where the student demonstrates what they know before the teacher engages them in the next activity. The next activity here that is common in the science teacher's lesson plan is an exit slip, where students are asked to complete in a minute information which will serve as feedback to the teacher on what they have learned. And the rationale here stated on the lesson plan by the student is that it will allow the candidate to know how much the student has already accomplished, which will allow the teacher to plan the next lesson accordingly. Based on many other evidence that I have collected on students' lesson plan, I am able to confirm that teacher candidates employ knowledge on how children learn based on learning theories that they learned in the educational psychology course, which is the first course that they take in the program. They are able to integrate key strategies of formative assessment that embodies content, knowledge, and skills. The learning goals are usually built or often built off the content standard. Teacher candidates demonstrate knowledge in the NGSS, presenting the 3 dimensions in the lesson plan, and ask questions that will engage students in attaining the learning goal. The instructional sequence are logical and demonstrate teacher candidates' knowledge in learning progression. There is therefore a lot of evidence in the teacher candidates' foundational base on formative assessment. In concluding, I would say that the teacher candidates develop foundational knowledge and skills for effective formative assessment in science, seen in their lesson and unit plans. The extent to which they actually implement the plans is another topic. The hope is that teacher candidates will continue to grow in their formative assessment knowledge during the induction years and as in-service teachers to enhance content-specific knowledge and practices in formative assessment. The implication of this presentation, that is a subsection of a research I am conducting, is that everyone who is interested in enhancing science education in schools must focus on the disciplinary content knowledge. Formative assessment is more than the general knowledge that we have continued to implement and emphasize to our students. There is a need for examples of formative assessment practices that focus on science. There is a new tool for FAST, which will become very useful for science teachers and science teacher educators. Formative assessment is the core for effective teaching and learning of science and must be given its right place in the teacher education program. Thank you, and if you have any comments or questions, feel free to send them through my email and I will respond to them.